In the 1990s, many believed that globalization and multilateralism were unstoppable. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, the world responded with near unanimity. The Security Council, with the United States and the Soviet Union voting on the same side, swiftly condemned the invasion and authorized a global coalition to reverse it. It felt like the dawn of a new era of cooperation. But that optimism didn't last. Today, the headlines tell a different story. The United States is pulling out of climate agreements, Britain left the European Union, Russia defied international law in Ukraine, and China is promoting alternative institutions, while groupings like the BRICS challenge Western dominance. What changed? How did the world go from a moment of unprecedented unity to one of deep and bitter division? Are we witnessing the end of the multilateral era or just the beginning of something new? We explored multilateralism in an earlier video, contrasting it with unilateral and bilateral approaches. Remember that the key point is this: multilateralism is more than just cooperation among several states. As John Ruggie pointed out, it's a principle of organizing relations based on generalized rules of conduct, inclusivity, and indivisible collective interests. In other words, it centers on the idea of states agreeing to follow the same rules, even when doing so doesn't give them an immediate advantage. Since 1945, this principle has been the foundation of the global order. Institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Health Organization were all built on the idea that collective rules and institutions make the world more stable and predictable than ad hoc deals or power politics alone. And for a time, this system seemed remarkably successful. It helped prevent direct great power wars, supported a massive expansion of global trade, and provided framework for cooperation on health, development, and human rights. For many, multilateralism became synonymous with progress. But now, this system is under pressure. Great power competition, nationalist politics, inequality between North and South, and new global challenges are testing the limits of multilateralism. Understanding these pressures requires looking at where the system came from and why it's struggling today. One of the biggest challenges to multilateralism today is the return of great power rivalry. For much of the 1990s and early 2000s, it looked like the United States stood alone as the world's dominant power. With Russia weakened and China still rising, the U.S. often set the agenda in global institutions. Some even talked about a unipolar moment, but today that landscape looks very different. U.S. China competition is reshaping the global order. The two powers cooperate when their interests align, but they're increasingly at odds over trade, technology, human rights, and especially influence in Asia. China has built new institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and promoted groupings like the BRICS, signaling frustration with Western-led institutions. China argues that their efforts are complementary to existing institutions. Critics frame them as alternatives intended to displace existing Western-led institutions. And for its part, the United States has sometimes embraced multilateralism, but often prefers bilateral arrangements, issue-specific partnerships where it can retain more control or, even unilateralism. Russia's actions have also put multilateralism under strain. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, and especially the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, violated core principles of the UN Charter. But the Security Council's been largely paralyzed. Russia can and does use its veto to block meaningful action. What was once envisioned as the ultimate guarantor of international peace has instead become a stage for geopolitical deadlock. These rivalries spill out into other areas as well. Multilateral institutions that depend on consensus, like the World Trade Organization, have struggled as U.S. and China clash over trade rules. Even global health institutions like the World Health Organization have become politicized as disputes over COVID-19 origins and vaccine distribution mirrored great power tensions. The result is that multilateralism increasingly looks less like a neutral system of rules and more like just another arena for great power politics. When the great powers cooperate, institutions work. When they don't, the system stalls or fractures into competing blocks. And today, more often than not, rivalry is winning out over cooperation. A second major challenge to multilateralism comes not from great power rivalries, but from within the states themselves, the rise of nationalism and populism. In many countries, political leaders have embraced a rhetoric of taking back control or putting the nation first. They frame international agreements and institutions not as sources of stability, but as constraints on sovereignty and threats to national identity. The United States offers a vivid example. Under President Trump, the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement and pulled out of the World Health Organization, the UN Human Rights Council, and has imposed a wide range of new tariffs, all explicitly part of the America First approach to foreign policy. And Europe has seen similar dynamics. The United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union, Brexit, was fueled in part by nationalist and populist arguments about EU membership undermining British sovereignty. Elsewhere in Europe, populist parties have gained traction by opposing immigration and criticizing the EU's bureaucracy. And beyond the West, leaders like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and Narendra Modi in India have emphasized national sovereignty and domestic priorities over international cooperation on issues like climate change or migration. These trends matter because multilateralism depends on political will. Institutions can only work if member states are willing to compromise, follow rules, and share burdens. When nationalist and populist leaders frame cooperation as weakness and international institutions as illegitimate, the space for meaningful cooperation narrows. In short, domestic politics, especially the rise of populism and nationalism, have eroded the consensus that once supported multilateralism, adding another layer of strain to the global order. A third major challenge to multilateralism comes from questions of fairness and legitimacy and the divide between the global north and the global south. Many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America argue that multilateral institutions were designed in the mid-20th century to reflect the power of wealthy, mostly Western states, and that they haven't adapted to today's realities. The UN Security Council is perhaps the clearest example of this. Its 5 permanent members reflect the world of 1945, not the 21st century. Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, home to a majority of the world's population, have no permanent representation. And while reform has been debated for decades, real change has proven elusive. Economic governance also reflects this imbalance. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank are dominated by advanced industrialized economies, and decision-making structures in those organizations are weighted towards wealthy states through quotas and shareholdings, giving Western countries greater influence. Loan conditions often reflect Western priorities, and many in the global South see these institutions as imposing austerity and limiting sovereignty rather than fostering development. Recent crises have highlighted these divides even more starkly. During the COVID-19 pandemic, wealthy countries secured the bulk of early vaccine supplies, while initiatives like COVAX struggled to ensure equitable access for poorer states. In climate negotiations, developing countries have pressed for financial support to adapt to the effects of climate change, which they've contributed least to causing, but pledges of climate finance have often fallen short. From the perspective of many states in the global South, multilateralism too often looks like a system run by and for wealthy countries of the North. That perception undermines legitimacy and makes it harder to build the trust necessary for global cooperation. And addressing these divides will be essential if multilateralism is to remain relevant in the 21st century. A fourth challenge to multilateralism is the growing gap between the global problems and the institutions meant to address them. Many of the institutions we've discussed, from the UN to the WTO to the WHO, were designed in the mid-20th century. They've adapted over time, but they often struggle to keep up with the speed and scale of 21st century crises. Climate change is perhaps the clearest example. Nearly every country has signed on to agreements like the Paris Climate Accord, yet global emissions continue to rise. The science is clear, but international institutions have been too slow, too weak, or too fragmented to drive the level of cooperation and enforcement needed. Global health offers another case. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Health Organization provided guidance and coordination, but it lacked the resources and authority to ensure rapid testing, equitable vaccine distribution, or transparent information sharing. In many ways, national responses, for example, border closures and vaccine hoarding, undermined the very multilateral cooperation that was needed. And new technologies pose even greater challenges. Issues like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and data privacy are all profoundly global, but there are few binding international rules to govern them. This is partly because the new technology is evolving faster than diplomatic negotiations keep up, and partly because great powers see dominance in these new domains as a key strategic advantage, making them reluctant to agree to new binding rules. So, while there have been attempts to tackle these issues multilaterally, for example, UN working groups on cybersecurity and discussions of emerging AI ethics, progress has been slow and states remain deeply divided on rules and enforcement. Instead, states and corporations are currently operating in a kind of legal gray zone where norms are emerging but enforcement is minimal. The result is a mismatch as emerging global challenges move faster than the institutions designed to manage them. Multilateralism hasn't entirely disappeared, but it's increasingly reactive, struggling to keep pace with the problems that transcend borders and demand urgent solutions. All of these challenges raise a bigger question that scholars and policymakers have been debating for years. Are we witnessing the end of the liberal international order? After World War II, and especially after the Cold War, many believed the world was moving towards a stable order built on liberal values, open markets, democratic governance, and respect for human rights, as well as rules-based institutions. The United States was a central pillar of that system, underwriting institutions like the UN, NATO, the IMF, and the World Bank, while promoting free trade through the WTO and other agreements. Today, however, that order looks fragile. The United States itself has stepped back from global leadership, prioritizing domestic politics over international commitments. Rising powers like China and Russia have challenged liberal norms and seek to promote alternative institutions and values. And within many democracies, populist and national movements question the cost of international cooperation altogether. Some analysts, especially realists like John Mearsheimer, argue that the liberal order was always unstable. From this perspective, what we're seeing now is not a collapse, but a return to the normal cycle of great power competition in a multipolar world. Others, like the liberal scholar John Eikenberry, take a more optimistic view, maintaining that while U.S. leadership has weakened and the order is under strain, the basic institutions and rules of liberal internationalism remain resilient. For Eikenberry, the liberal order is not collapsing, but adapting, as more states buy into its frameworks and its institutions adjust to new power realities. Defenders of the liberal order point out that despite setbacks, many multilateral institutions remain active and effective. The Paris Climate Agreement still has near universal membership. The WTO, though struggling, continues to regulate much of global trade, and the UN continues to set agendas on development and humanitarian issues. From this perspective, the liberal order may be fraying, but it's also adapting. The debate then is not about whether the liberal international order is ending, but about what might come next. Are we moving towards a more fragmented world of competing blocs, or towards a reformed multilateral system that reflects new power realities? And perhaps most importantly, what does this mean for the ability of the international community to tackle global challenges in the 21st century? Over the course of this unit, we've explored the complex machinery of global governance, from the ideals of the UN Charter to the realities of peacekeeping to the foundations of international law. All of these tools were created to help manage global problems through cooperation. The question for your generation is whether these tools are still fit for purpose or whether we need to invent new ones. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.